Our second speaker is Eric MEYERS, Bernice and Morton Lerner, Emeritus Professor in Judaic Studies at Duke University. He is very well known here since Carol and Eric were guest professors here 2 years ago, and I think it's really a pleasure that several of our speakers really belong to our academic community as former guest professors. Eric is one of the few scholars who bring biblical studies and archaeology together in a highly competent way. He was the obvious choice, therefore, to be invited to speak on the topic Pharisees, purity concerns, and common Judaism in light of archaeology. Eric, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Joseph, for this invitation. And when you invited me, I recall that you asked me to reconsider the essay by Jim Strange, Pharisees and Archaeology, published in 2007, and that work he concluded about 2004 or so, and was published in a book, In Quest of the Historical Pharisees, edited by Jacob Neusner and Bruce Chilton, and that's a very rich source of further study for this distinguished group gathered here today. Let me begin with a consideration, a summary of Strange's points, and I will go over each one of them in the light of the considerable research and new discoveries that have happened in the last 15 to 20 years. Strange takes up these as being relevant to the material culture of the Pharisees. 1, table, fellowship, and chalkstone vessels, and here you see a selection of chalkstone vessels from Jerusalem. Ritual immersion of dishes in large chalkstone vessels. Ritual baths, or mikvaot. Ritual washing of the hands before eating in small measuring cups of chalkstone vessels. Resurrection and afterlife in tombs and ossuaries. And finally, synagogue activity and synagogue plans and architecture, especially the earliest synagogues. And I mentioned to this audience that now in Judea we have approximately 8 or 9 synagogues dated conclusively to the Second Temple period. Actually, Rachel Achlili lists 16 of them, but I'd say 8 or 10 of them are certainly secure, and we have now 4 or 5 in the Galilee, the latest of which is Magdala from the 1st century of the Common Era. So these are the suggestions of Strange years ago, and he goes on to make the suggestion noting that the Qumran sectarians were the only other group that was deeply concerned with public purity. And he uses the word public, and I would contest that today because one of the main conclusions that I draw from recent archaeological work is that purity practices are so widespread in 1st century Judea and Galilee that they touch all groups, however you define them. Identifying a particular group or sect such as the Pharisees as represented in some form of material culture without inscriptional corroboration would be considered an enormous, if not impossible, challenge. No one has ever taken the population estimates in Josephus at face value, let alone his estimates for the population of the Pharisees, though he says quite clearly that they were popular among all the people in Antiquities 13. In thinking about how to relate aspects of material culture to the Pharisees, thus, we need to be mindful of the obvious fact that we cannot be certain of how many Pharisees there were. Even so, the New Testament and Josephus, when taken together, seem to indicate that they were a relatively small group who taught the common people, Luke 5, practicing purity laws, tithing, and table fellowship. But knowing that many more adhered to Pharisaic views of afterlife, including the followers of Jesus, who could also have shared common views concerning how to oppose Rome, especially those who adopted a quietistic point of view, we may say that Pharisaic ideas were far more widespread than the major literary sources would lead us to believe, namely Josephus and the New Testament. But that does not mean, however, that the task of finding a Pharisaic imprint on material culture is easy. On the contrary, this makes the challenge even more difficult. The fact is that the archaeological record today is quite clear that purity practices were widespread during the late Second Temple period we are discussing, and more than 1,000 mikvaot, or ritual baths, have now been identified in the land of Israel, and they may be associated with any number of groups. Pharisees, to be sure, pilgrims, commoners, even Sadducees. And in the domestic area of the Western Summit at Sepphoris, where Carol and I have excavated for decades, dated to the early Roman period or late Second Temple period, we have more than 30 ritual baths associated with upper-class domiciles, some of which may be possibly identified with priests. Nonetheless, several scholars in the past have identified special aspects of the material culture of this period with the Pharisees. Leading the pack was Levi Yitzchak Rahmani years ago, who suggested that the appearance of limestone ossuaries in the Herodian period in the 1st century BCE may be identified with the Pharisees and their belief in resurrection. This is a subject I dealt with in my doctoral dissertation. Magnus and I have been very forceful in challenging such a view. Jody Magnus writes, "There is no correlation between relative wealth and status of the deceased and the ornamentation of the ossuary, since plain and uninscribed ossuaries have been found in tombs belonging to some of ancient Jerusalem's most prominent families. And the discovery of this ossuary, the Caiaphas ossuary in 1992, a high priest and Sadducee, however, did not dissuade Rahmani from his views, and he published in 1994, several years after the discovery, in his catalog, repeating his statement that they belonged to the Pharisees. Sadducees, according to Josephus, would have eschewed any belief in afterlife, let alone in resurrection. Even the discovery of a crucified man, Yehochanan, in an ossuary in Givat HaMivtar, Jerusalem, indicates a secondary reburial of disarticulated remains was very important for a criminal or one punished by the Romans. It also demonstrates a strong belief in afterlife or resurrection and adherence to laws of Jewish burial and reburial. Suffice it to say that in our view it is not possible to limit ossuary burial to the Pharisees. McCain has in fact identified 2 new passages as referring to ossuligium or reburial of the bones in Matthew 8:21 and Luke 9:57, following passages that had previously been thought to be enigmatic, let the dead bury the dead. We have already suggested that ritual baths at Sepphoris on the Western Summit may be associated with the wealthier priestly class. Such an inference was made primarily on the basis of the size of homes and the artifacts found within them. Also, having a ritual bath in a private domicile may be construed as something of an extravagance, which would not fit the profile of what a Pharisee would have been. The fact is that we find in the practice of immersion already in the Pentateuch in Leviticus, and the elite practice of hip bathing may have even influenced the beginning of the individual ritual bath in the late Hellenistic period. In addition, the fact that we have so many different contexts and locations for ritual baths means that it is absolutely impossible to say that they all would have been related to a particular group such as the Pharisees. Stuart Miller has suggested that there was no standard way for mikvaot to be constructed, and ritual purity remained a concern long after the disappearance of individual purpose-built ritual baths or mikvaot. Some years ago, Jonathan Adler made the point that ritual baths adjacent to agricultural installations apparently followed Pharisaic ruling on matters of ritual purity. His main support for this was the Pharisaic concept of Tavul Yom, which differs greatly from the practice of the Sadducees and Qumran sectarians. In a recent email communication last August, he wrote me the following: "Today I would be more nuanced so as not to sound as if I am identifying the builders and users of these installations as Pharisees or their followers per se. Today I would simply say that the people who made use of these step pools of mikvaot probably followed an interpretation similar to that attributed by the rabbis to the Pharisees and apparently also to the addressee of MMT." End quote. Nothing can gainsay the fact that so many such step pools are today attested in such a variety of settings, which suggest using great caution in making any definitive relation between a particular ritual bath and group of individuals who built or used them. This is simply too much to ask of the archaeological record. Still, my former colleague, E.P. Sanders, back in 1992, was convinced that the Pharisees' conception of pure or valid water was manifested in the otsar, or transfer device found in some mikvaot. The wide distribution of ritual baths in so many different contexts, near agricultural installation, near graves, in private domiciles, in and around synagogues, nonetheless, only supports Sanders' assertion that purity laws were practiced widely and observed generally by the Jewish population. Therefore, I believe we cannot say with certainty that ritual baths with an otsar are Pharisaic. This point is relevant to consideration now of chalkstone vessels. And there you have a beautiful reconstruction of Sepphoris, where those 30-some ritual baths were excavated by us. Since the appearance of Yitzhak Magen's influential study on these stone vessels appeared in Hebrew in 1988, there has been a veritable explosion of works on the subject of this industry in late Second Temple times and early Roman times. It has been commonplace to assert that when chalkstone vessels are found in a domicile, along with other indicators such as ritual baths, decorated lamps with Jewish symbols, faunal remains devoid of pig bones, or any other forbidden foods, that the residents were Jewish. There has also been the working assumption for years now that the lifespan or main period of use for such vessels was from the Herodian period to the 2nd century CE, till sometime after the Bar Kokhba rebellion ended in 135. However, recent work by Hebrew University team led by Zev Weiss has demonstrated that, in fact, chalkstone vessels of a regional provenance have been found in context dating to the end of the Roman period and even into the 4th century CE. Miller has used the term early Byzantine, dating their use, quoting Amit and Adler. In any case, associating them with purity concerns is due to the fact that they are mostly deemed impermeable to impurity, a datum that supports Miller's thesis that adherence to a biblically based Torah laws remain constant without interruption in the rabbinic period, although growing more complex through late antiquity, and did not disappear at the end of the Tannaitic period, as some scholars maintain. The sharp rise in synagogue or building or rebuilding in the early Byzantine period, despite the rise of imperial Christianity, goes along with such a view and does not necessarily support the idea that Jewish life was in decline after the 2 wars with Rome, as has been suggested by a number of scholars such as Seth Schwartz and others. Strange had wanted us to think of chalkstone measuring cups as being used by Pharisees in celebrating table fellowship. But today, finding them in such diverse contexts in so many places makes such an assumption unlikely. Similarly, to think of the large lathe-turned standing bowls as being used only by Pharisees rather than by simple Torah-observant Jews, such as those attending the wedding at Cana, as described in John 2:6, is just as improbable. What the evidence today does say is that there was a large industry in Judea that produced such vessels in the late Second Temple period, and connected to that industry was the production of ossuaries as well. Since ossuaries required the reburial of bones, ossulegium, the collection of those bones being described in greater detail in Moed, Mishnah Moed Katan, and other sources, obviously fear of corpse impurity was overridden by observance of the obligation to rebury the remains of the dead, especially parents. Sometimes in the early Roman period and after the wars with Rome, a similar industry grew up in Nazareth, or near Nazareth, at Reina and Einot Amitai, excavation reports of which are not yet available, but excavation by Ariel University and Yonatan Adler and others are ongoing. This made it possible for the Jewish community that moved north to obtain vessels that were accustomed to using in Judea in their new local setting. That some of the uses of these newly crafted vessels were of more secular or quotidian sort is highly likely, as no doubt was the continued use of them for purity purposes. In sum, the great variety of chalkstone vessels that we find and their locations, whether in simple domiciles or extravagant priestly residences in Jerusalem or agricultural installations in rural settings, means that it is simply impossible to make any neat correspondence between those who use them and what those users believed. Turning to Strange's assumption about ancient synagogues, I show the purported late Second Temple synagogue from Jericho. Strange's claim that there had been a Pharisaic concern for the institution of the synagogue since its Second Temple origins as a purpose-built structure cannot be denied. However, claiming that we can therefore associate those synagogues with Pharisees through specific architectural linkages with temple courts, which frankly I do not recognize as being ubiquitous in early pre-70 synagogues, namely their covered hallways and benches, does not meet the test of time, in my opinion. In a way, Strange was expanding on a popular suggestion made in the 1950s by Gedalia Alon, who in his classic work claimed that the Pharisees were the dominant religious and social force in the Second Temple period, and who were followed by the Talmudic sages after 70. Lee Levine cites others who followed such a view, but he is much more circumspect and nuanced in his views about both the extent of influence of the Pharisees before and after 70. And while there is today a growing body of evidence, as I indicated, in Judea and in the Galilee for early synagogues, especially in the Galilee, we may not make too much about this because none of them, in my opinion, as I've said, imitate what is going on in the temple. And here are a few of these examples that you may or may not be familiar with. And now I turn to something more positive. My last area of inquiry regarding a possible Pharisaic imprint on the material record concerns phylacteries and the scrolls or slips of scrolls contained within them. I've found a surprising and positive result, or at least a possible avenue of correspondence between them. In this endeavor, I'm once again indebted to my colleague in Israel, Yonatan Adler, whose current long-term project focuses on household religion in the periods under discussion. I've also spoken to Sidney White, a close colleague and Qumran specialist, who concurs that this is probably the only possible area of correspondence, that is phylactery scrolls and their containers and Pharisaic use. We talked extensively about whether or not further study of the provenance and how the deposition history cave by cave in Qumran might one day help let us identify some of those scrolls as coming from particular libraries or collections. But at the moment, I think she and I and others have concluded, I think it's just too early in research to do that. But we're still, believe it or not, learning new things, especially about the deposition history, cave by cave, of groups of scrolls and the families of scrolls within them. Adler has published 2 papers on the subject of the Phylactery Scrolls, also known as Tefillin, and I will indicate his earlier thoughts are much more positive in making this possible linkage between Pharisees and what he calls type 1 tefillin slips. He goes on to identify 8Q Phil 1, that's Cave 8 Phylactery Scrolls, and 4Q Phil D to F, as being completely compatible with Pharisaic social practices and norms, as over against a larger group that he identifies as having non-Masoretic textual characteristics. 11 of 24 phylactery slips have a vulgar orthography, and 9 of them having a more traditional orthography. His early remarks on this are most relevant to our discussion. He writes, "The discovery of Qumran phylacteries that comply with Pharisaic practice is less surprising than might have been imagined prima facie. Members of the Qumran sect came to Qumran from outside the community, and it is to be expected that at least some members who joined the sect brought with them phylacteries that they owned prior to their acceptance in the community. The 2 slips identified as type 1, 8Q Phil 1 and 4Q Phil D to F, thus would be the only possible artifacts that could be identified as coming from Pharisaic circles in the late Second Temple period. All the other slips examined at that time would have displayed either a vulgar orthography and or sectarian text or alternative text to the MT Masoretic text. 10 years later, Adler is a bit more cautious in his conclusions. In this more recent study, he takes into account only the text types found in the phylactery itself and the morphology of the leather tefillin cases themselves. He correctly urges caution also in respect to the issue of provenance, since so many were purchased by the Bedouin, as we know. The 2 types of cases differed in regard to how textual scrolls are stored within the boxes. They are either a single compartment type or multiple compartment types, such as you have in the slide. However, in pointing out the multiplicity of tefillin types along with variant textual types, it is difficult to avoid the simple conclusion that the different types represent different groups. The fact that these different types were hidden in different caves suggests that the reason for doing so was precisely because they were viewed as heterodox. And I was hoping to find something in the Dead Sea Scrolls corpus that I could say similar things about, but I have not been able to do that. Such variety exists even in caves 4Q and 8Q of type 1, which Adler had thought pre-shadowed rabbinic practice, as does the simpler single compartment type case. Nonetheless, in his conclusion to this latter article, he says, quote, "The data is insufficient to allow us to assign either of these types to any particular Second Temple group." After a bit of back and forth, in person and in email, in recent conversation, he concluded that all he would say today with confidence is that, quote, "Type 1 slips prefigure the kind of tefillin called for by the Tannaitic rabbis. I would be confident in going perhaps a bit farther than this in using the term proto-rabbinic to describe type 1 slips and their cases, and leave open the possibility that we may just have in those artifacts physical traces of the Pharisees." To my conclusions. So where does this leave us? First, I think it takes the halo off of archaeology. That is, we cannot expect archaeology to do more than it should or might do. Identifying the Pharisees as a small particular group within a complex society in first century Palestine is hard enough, let alone seeking to find physical traces of them in the material record. With written remains such as what we have found in the phylactery boxes and slips of texts, it is about as close as we can ever come to succeeding in such a quest. As for the other matters we have considered, in taking our cue from Strange, we have not exactly come up empty-handed. What we have discovered in most of the points Strange made is evidence for a common Judaism that was ever more faithful in keeping purity practices in their daily lives. And even in this regard, especially in respect to mikvaot, the great diversity in types of immersion facilities urges caution in trying to identify specifically those who made them and those who used them. That chalkstone vessels were used to facilitate purity rules and practice should not surprise us. But even those artifacts certainly had other uses by many different individuals. Finally, in respect to ossuaries, I agree that they suggest the belief in afterlife, even possibly resurrection. But such a view was very widespread in its day, and with priests using them as well, without the aid of corroborating inscriptions, it's nearly impossible to relate any burial box, whether ossuary or sarcophagus, or even simple pit burial, to a specific form of belief or afterlife. I'm grateful to Professor Sivas for raising the subject again of how archaeology might help in shedding further light on the Pharisees, and I'm indebted also to my late colleague, James F. Strange, for having made a valiant attempt at doing just that, and opening up new ways of viewing important markers of how Jews in the late Second Temple period practiced purity. What I have discovered instead is that purity practices were far more widespread, and that many Jews employed them in their daily lives, even until late antiquity. This should hardly be surprising in view of the emergence of the bulk of rabbinic literature at this time. To be sure, the sages were the recipient of the legacy of the Pharisees, but for now, that will have to be sufficient. Thank you.